The short answer to that question is that the role of nuclear weapons in Russian national security policy has increased. But that short answer does not really tell the whole story. The Russian nuclear strategy has already passed through 2 stages after the end of the Cold War, and I think that we'll see the 3rd stage, well, in a few years only. During the 1990s, the role of nuclear weapons in Russian policy was really minimal. Officially, of course, it remained a nuclear state, although it had all the privileges of a nuclear state, but really nuclear weapons were assigned to just one type of mission, and that's global war. And of course, for the 90s, but even today, global war is extremely unlikely. So in fact, you can say that in the 90s, the role of nuclear weapons in Russian policy was symbolic. The change came in 1999, the war in Kosovo. I think that the war in Kosovo really played an immensely big role in the change of Russian national security policy, foreign policy, and nuclear strategy. At that point, Moscow decided to introduce a new mission for nuclear weapons, and that's limited use in response to a limited conventional attack on Russia. Of course, at that time, Russian conventional forces were way too weak to sustain any kind of defense, so it was decided to threaten limited use of nuclear weapons in response to a Kosovo-style attack on Russia, and that's the period that we're in now. Limited, it actually means very limited, below 10 nuclear weapons, primarily against military targets. The 3rd stage that we might see in probably 5 to 7 years is actually the reduction of the role of nuclear weapons. From the very beginning, from the 2000 military doctrine, has been an official position of Russia that reliance on nuclear weapons is temporary, until such time that Russia develops modern conventional capability. Yes, it's been working on that for a long time, for now 15 years, and well, in my at least view, according to my research, it will complete the task in about 5 to 7 years. Of course, once it completes that task, on nuclear weapons will not be that needed anymore, and I think next decade we'll see a reduction again the role of nuclear weapons in Russian foreign policy, and I think that Russia will become more positive toward reduction of nuclear weapons and perhaps eventual elimination. Okay. Well, of course, the countries have very different status. 2 countries are official nuclear powers, 1 unofficial nuclear power, and 2 non-nuclear states. Now, the differences in terms of non-proliferation policy, I think, are actually minimal. Well, one example of differences is that Russia and China support the additional protocol, and Brazil is skeptical about the additional protocol. But like on all the basic kind of points on non-proliferation regimes, I think all countries share their positions. The picture is very different on arms control and disarmament, of course, because non-nuclear states really want to eliminate nuclear weapons, but Russia and China are, well, not as positive, let's put it like that, toward that goal. Russia does see a very serious role for nuclear weapons in its national security policy. China is extremely quiet about the role of nuclear weapons. but it does not really support even arms control measures at the moment, saying that it will only consider seriously such measures when the United States and Russia reduce somewhere close to its level. Which is basically to say that it doesn't want to do that, really. So yes, that's the biggest difference within the BRICS. Quite positive, very similar positions on non-proliferation, and very different positions on disarmament. So one can only hope that the group can still pursue cooperation on the areas where they agree. The choice of partners is actually very simple. Anyone who can pay. That's the short answer. The longer answer is that Russia does seek to do business in spreading peaceful uses of nuclear energy, of nuclear power. Yes, it wants to build nuclear power plants. It wants to provide technologies, plants, everything. Well, let's put it like that. On technologies, it's not as open as on nuclear power in general, because technologies, well, mean money. So Russia does actually stick to some of its technological secrets. An interesting development that's very actually recent in Russian policy for nuclear trade and cooperation is the expansion beyond the former Soviet Union. In particular, I think of great significance is the discussion between Russia and South Africa on the construction of a plant in South Africa to produce nuclear fuel for Russian-built reactors. So that's quite sensitive technology. That's very important technology, and if that project really flies, then it will mean that Russia will become even more open look on these fronts. Now, an obvious question is, how does this policy sit with non-proliferation regimes? I would say that Russia is a country that is a very staunch, very strong supporter of nuclear non-proliferation regimes, but where it comes to cooperation in nuclear power, it tends to take a very restrictive kind of interpretation of its obligations. So it sticks to the minimum restrictions that you can imagine. His examples actually are plenty. For example, it continued to construct a nuclear power plant in Iran, the plans with South Africa, and so on and so forth. So to the extent that non-proliferation obligations do not completely ban cooperation in some areas and with some countries, it will pursue such cooperation. That's a very complex question. On the one hand, the United States and Russia, of course, share commitment to the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And they do cooperate on a lot of things within that regime, and positions between the two countries are quite similar on the majority of issues, but not on everything. In fact, one of the big differences between the current period and the Cold War, in fact, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated very closely on non-proliferation. That's not the case now. There are several things where the positions of the two countries differ. One, in Russia, there is very strong suspicion that the United States is using non-proliferation just to promote its own interests and as a cover-up for unrelated policies. And I think that the war in Iraq in 2003 is a very good example for that. So that's one thing. Two, Russia does sometimes, actually quite often, see U.S. non-proliferation policies, various sanctions and restrictions, as the use of non-proliferation to prevent economic development, like in trade, that Russia can have in peaceful use of nuclear power. So these things do actually kind of create differences. And finally, I would say, that's a more fundamental kind of level. In Russia, you can really see very, very clearly that it primarily supports the traditional non-proliferation regimes. The regimes that are based on treaties that are negotiated and so on and so forth, well, like the NPT, quite obviously, and it's much more skeptical with regard to informal regimes such as PSI, the Proliferation Security Initiative. So yes, you can also see a lot of differences in that area as well. But of course, there is quite strong cooperation on some specific issues. For example, the two countries worked quite closely in negotiations with Iran. The two countries cooperated on Syrian chemical weapons. So you might say that there is plenty of cooperation on specific issues, but the positions, the approaches of the two countries to more general kind of issues are quite different sometimes. Thank you.